Genesis chapter 37, verses 29 to 36, and the Word of God says, "When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, 'The boy isn't there. What will I do now?' Then they got Joseph's robe, killed a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the beautiful robe back to their father and said, 'We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe.' He recognized it and said, 'It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces.' Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and grieved for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. 'No,' he said, 'I will continue to grieve until I join my son in the grave.' So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of the Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. May God bless the reading of his word.
Amen. It's amazing how quickly disasters can come into our lives. I think these are the kind of disasters we hear about on the news. The kind of 1 minute everything's fine, everything's good, and then the clouds darken on the horizon, and all of a sudden disaster falls into our lives, and everything changes. Well, that's the way it was for Jacob when he found out about his son Joseph. Jacob was just, I'm sure, sitting back at the camp waiting for his sons to come back in from the field, and he must have known when he saw them. His 11 sons coming back toward him that something was wrong. And sure enough it was. He looked and he saw that his favorite son Joseph was missing. And he said, "Where's my son? Where is Joseph?" Well, the boys gave him Joseph's robe, and they had torn it, and they had bloodied it to make it look like Joseph had been killed by a wild animal. And Jacob saw that, and that's the assumption he made, and disaster descended upon him, descended upon his family. It came so suddenly. He wouldn't find out for years and years that Joseph was still alive. He had been sold into slavery in Egypt, but as far as the father knew, his favorite son was dead. And it was a disaster. It came so quickly upon them. Let's take a look for a minute how this family dealt with that. This family of faith, how did they deal with this disaster? Well, actually, before we get to that, let's recognize one thing, and that is how often Egypt can be this way. Now, there are some people that seem to be this way all the time, on the lookout for disaster. And they want to make disaster, even if it's not in their lives. And so we hear them say things like, that vacation was a disaster. Because the room wasn't ready on time, because they encountered some traffic, because the hamburger was overcooked, the vacation becomes a disaster. And just a quick warning is how easy it is for us to get in that mind frame. We're the ones who are starting to be on the lookout and try to find disasters to have a little drama made into our lives. I'm not sure why. And that's something we can avoid, because friends, we get enough real disasters. And that's what I want to talk about today, the real disasters that descend upon us, and how do we deal with them? Well, what is a disaster first? Disaster literally means against the stars, and so it refers back to astrology in those days when people believed that the stars guided what would happen to them in their lives. And so a disaster is something that happens against the stars or against fate. But we know what a disaster really is. A disaster is something, when it happens to us, this terrible thing, it changes everything. It changes everything. Our lives are completely turned around, completely changed. And then what is it? It's up to us to change with our lives. That becomes the challenge for us. Are we going to be able to change? Are we going to be able to adapt to this disaster that has occurred in our lives. And we see the ways that some of the folks in this story, they weren't busy adapting. They were doing other things. That is a warning to us, something that we can often find ourselves doing. Instead of coping, instead of changing, instead of dealing and adapting to the situation, instead of, in the midst of hopelessness, starting to look for some hope in our lives, seeking it out with the help of God by following His Son, Jesus Christ. What do we do instead? Well, the first temptation is when there's a disaster, right away, let's spend a lot of time assigning blame. Assigning blame. Who is at fault for this? And we see this in the story. Reuben, the oldest brother, he assumed some of the blame. Gosh, he should have looked out for his brother. He should have watched out for Joseph. And then, Joseph himself, surely there's some blame there. He was out spreading around. He's arrogant, rude to his brothers. He was spoiled by his father, and so maybe his father too. He's partly to blame for what happened to Joseph, his son. And of course, the 11 brothers, they're to blame as well. And we could just spend hours and hours dividing up the blame, figuring out who's most to blame and who's next most to blame, and portioning it all out. And what a waste of time that is. Especially as we're facing a disaster in our life, something that's requiring us to change and to adapt. We're going to spend all our time thinking about who is responsible, who is to blame. And that can take all of our time away, all our attention away from what we need to be doing. And I tell you, we're never going to find hope that way. That's not the way that God is going to reveal hope to us, is by assigning blame. There are times when, we need to think about why things happen and so on, but it's not going to get us through. It's not going to get us to the other side. So what do we need to do? Or maybe what don't we need to do? Assigning blame is one thing that we could do that wouldn't be any good at all. And so is another, and that's actually what Jacob did. The father. The brothers felt guilty. Well, Jacob was mourning. He was grieving. And he was, to paraphrase the New Testament, he was mourning as those who have no hope. Have no hope. He had no hope. And so he said, he was starting his grieving process. He started mourning. And it said all his sons and all his daughters came to him and they tried to comfort him. And he said, I will not be comforted. I will not be comforted. I am going to grieve and mourn until I join my son in the grave. And that's what he decided to do. Give up. No change, no adapting, no moving forward, no looking for hope, no seeing a brighter future, none of that. Simply to give up. Simply to give in. And that's what he did. And so, when we see the temptation of that, in fact, both of these things are so tempting because, let me tell you, adapting to a disaster, changing ourselves, finding the hope, that is hard. That is difficult. It is easy assigning blame. We think it is easy giving up. That seems like the easiest option. Let's just give up. But you know what? When we give up, that just sticks us right where we are. It sticks us right in the middle of that disaster, and we never move forward out of it. We stay right there. And so what do we do? Who do we look to in this story? Well, let's look not to Jacob in his grieving and his hopelessness, not to the brothers in their guilt, but to Joseph. And what he does in this disaster. One thing you can say about this is that this disaster led Joseph to become the man that God wanted him to be. In fact, the Psalms tell us that it was when Joseph went to Egypt, when he was sold into slavery, that is when the steel was put into his soul. But he grew from this time, this disaster. And he grew out of it. Every time something different would happen, so many bad things kept happening to him time and time again, he would manage to adapt. You read this story, and this is one of these stories where 10, 20 years is covered in just a couple of verses. And so we forget that this is a long process, this adapting, this changing, this overcoming some disaster. But he did it step by step, day by day, overcoming and adapting to the new situations he was put in. It makes me think of how many of us, instead of finding a disaster coming into our lives quickly, we find it coming slowly, step by step, drip by drip. Here is this disaster coming into our lives. And it doesn't come in one giant swoop, one great flash. It comes into our lives one little disappointment at a time. I think about my friends, people that I've known in my life who have committed suicide. They've taken that option. And in my situation, my friends that have done that, none of them, it was for one great, huge disaster that came into their lives. It was because day after day, year after year, disappointment, one on top of the other, had piled up. And they just couldn't do it anymore. They felt it anymore. How easy it is to be caught in this mind frame. One disappointment on top of another leads us to feeling like we're in the midst of a disaster. Again, let's look to Joseph. Let's see what he did. He was sold into slavery. He became the best slave, right? Became ran the whole house. Then he was falsely accused. He got thrown in prison. And he became the best prisoner. Soon he was running the whole prison. And then, of course, eventually he comes out and he ends up being second in command in Egypt, just under the Pharaoh. We don't want disasters to come into our lives. And once they happen, we do anything that they wouldn't happen, that we can take them away. But that's not an option. Our option is to move through them. And to do it with God. To do it by following Jesus Christ. And sometimes to do it without any training at all. There's nothing we can do to get ready for it. We just have to deal with it. There's a story a couple of years ago about a fellow who was flying in a single-engine airplane. He was the passenger. And he was sitting there, and all of a sudden the pilot has a heart attack. And he can't wake him up. Imagine that. He's sitting there, and he's in the airplane, he doesn't know how to use anything. Well, he manages to figure out the radio, and fortunately, before the pilot had passed out, he had shown him just the basics of how you steer an airplane. So he knew the basics, and so knowing the basics, and then with a lot of help from the ground, he managed to land the airplane. Now, I read about this in a column, and the columnist made a great point. The columnist said, how often life is just like this. We get a little training, we get just ready in a little way, and then we're thrown into it. The columnist said that's the way it was for him going to college. His parents dropped him off at something that looked like a dorm and said something like, go get him, Tiger, and that was it. They were over. So that's what it was with marriage. His parents brought him to the altar, they sat down in their seats and go get him, Tiger, and then married. How much of our lives we spend without training, without readiness, dealing with the things and the bad things in life. And the guy who landed the airplane, he said something interesting. He said, I was scared, of course, but it was a funny kind of scared. I wasn't panicking. It was just a funny kind of, I don't know. I think, well, gosh, yeah, that's the way it is. That sounds familiar to me. I think so much of the time we're just thrown into things, right? Thrown into these disasters, and we have to deal with them. And no wonder we spend so much of our lives feeling this funny kind of scared. Not necessarily bad, getting us ready to overcome this next obstacle. And friends, we're not going to do it alone. We're going to do it by following Jesus Christ. We're going to do it by keeping God in our hearts, and we're going to find hope in that way. And that's really the journey we're on whenever we face a disaster. It's a journey from hopelessness to hope. We're not going to do it by assigning blame. We're not going to do it by giving up. We're going to do it the way Joseph did it, one day at a time, 1 week at a time, overcoming that disaster, overcoming that obstacle, and we can do it. It's not easy. It's never easy. It's like a battle. It's like a war. With God in our hearts, with Christ in our hearts, there is no disaster. There is no obstacle that we cannot overcome. To that I say, praise be to God. Let's bow in prayer. Loving God, we give thanks for all the blessings you give us, for all the strength you offer to us. And loving God, that's what we ask for today. today and every day. Lord, help us to feel your presence with us. Help us to know that you're here, giving us support and giving us strength no matter what befalls us. And help us to, Lord, always be keeping our eyes out. We may not be facing difficulty now. We may not be facing a disaster. But friends, we have brothers and sisters in Christ, brothers and sisters in our families. We have people around us, friends and neighbors who are. Help us to see them and help us to help them to deal with the disasters they're facing. It is in Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen.